story that hasn't gotten much coverage, but that marks a major break with the past in Syria. The death sentences handed down in Damascus this week against members of the former Assad regime. A court in the capital sentenced the former dictator Bashar al-Assad and his brother Maher to death in absentia. They were not in Damascus. They fled the country, obviously, after the fall of the regime. The court also sentenced an Assad cousin, Atef Najib, to death for murder and torture, which amounted to crimes against humanity. Najib was one of the most ruthless members of the regime in charge when children who'd graffitied a wall in Dara in the south were detained and tortured. One child named Hamza al-Khatib was killed in detention, aged only 13. I interviewed one of the boys who was detained back then and tortured when I was in Damascus last year, a grown man with his own children, who told me, of course, that he wanted justice. But the question is not so much were the sentences appropriate, as was the process appropriate. Reem Alaf, one of the most respected Syria analysts and authors, put it this way on X. Witnesses were not heard, the victims were not recognized, the specific crimes in all their horrific variety were not enumerated. In other words, the process itself was rushed, according to Alaf, perhaps to satisfy the completely understandable desire for justice and for accountability. Syria, for example, still has not introduced a transitional justice law designed to prosecute cases involving former Assad regime members, meaning the cases are being run on an ad hoc basis. Human rights groups like Human Rights Watch say that Syrians need a system that applies across the board so that the verdicts and sentences are rooted in legislation that has been conceived to deliver accountability and justice to the millions who suffered under Assad, while avoiding the perception that authorities are conducting speedy trials to satisfy public demands for accountability. Because members of the Assad regime ruined Syria. They crushed dissent, they tortured, they killed, they bombed, they forced into exile millions of people only to stay in power, enrich themselves, and in the end, like Bashar and his wife Asma and their families, live pretty cushy lives in Russia and elsewhere. These trials would have been a perfect opportunity to lay out all the evidence in minute detail, call witnesses and experts, conduct DNA tests on remains, for example, and many, many more important aspects to any trial. We understand that the court's verdict will be made publicly available so that the reasoning behind the decision can be seen by all of us, and that there will be an opportunity to see the mechanics of the court's verdict and sentencing. And then there is the other issue, the issue of the death penalty itself. Whether you believe in it or not doesn't matter as far as these specific examples are concerned, because many international organizations will not cooperate with countries that are likely to use it as a punishment. For example, the United Nations, their UN-backed judicial standards strictly restrict assistance in legal processes where the death penalty is likely to be used. In fact, the Syrian Network for Human Rights is saying that that penalty should be abandoned after this trial. And that matters because this process of holding regime members to account must rely on expert know-how and technology not always available in Syria, a country that has been cut off from the world for decades. There are also human rights groups who are opposed to the death penalty, not because they believe perpetrators should be given light sentences, but because execution as a punishment should not be carried out by a state wanting to break with the methods of the past. So obviously there are many angles and opinions on this story, and I've been reading with great interest what people around the world, Syrians abroad and inside the country, think. Let me know what you think in the comments.